Welcome to Colorado Criminal Defense with James Colgan.
From the front range to the courtroom, this is Colorado Criminal Defense with James Colgan. When your freedom and reputation are on the line, experience is the only thing that matters. In each episode, we go beyond the scenes of the justice system with James, a seasoned defense attorney dedicated to fighting for the accused across the state of Colorado. Whether you're facing charges or just want to understand your legal options, you're in the right place. I'm Lisa Mosbey, your host, and today we're talking about how bond and bail work in Colorado and why some people stay in jail. James, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Lisa. How are you?
I'm well, and this is an interesting topic to jump into. Not many of us have experience with this, but it's good to know in case we ever need it. Who decides whether someone gets out of jail after an arrest in Colorado, and how does that decision get made?
Well, there's a number of factors that go into whether or not somebody gets out of jail or gets out of jail on bond. Statutory, which means it's in the law, is in the statutes for crimes such as murder, there is no bond. Or you're at least entitled to a hearing to determine whether there's bond. That's one situation. Another situation is if someone is arrested and they're on parole from another case. Oftentimes they will not be eligible for bond. And then we've discussed in a previous episode things such as domestic violence, where you'll be held with no bond overnight until you see a judge, and then a judge can set a bond. And then a fourth condition can be an extradition situation where you're arrested for a crime from another state and they're asking that you be held with no bond until they come and get you from another state. That's a fourth situation in which there's no bond. All other conditions, you're eligible for a bond, and there are a number of factors that go into that, but it's usually the judge that determines what the amount of bond is, the conditions of bond, and those kind of things. It's usually the judge, and he looks at a schedule, can vary from that schedule depending on certain circumstances, but the judge has just a tremendous amount of discretion in determining what your bond is.
So does the time vary? Why do some folks get released quickly and some folks stay in custody, even on simpler charges?
As we've discussed in previous episodes, the criminal history is most often the reason that people either get released quickly or are held on a higher bond. Criminal history is usually the simple answer to why people get released quickly. If there's no criminal history, your chances of being released per schedule and quickly increase significantly.
Okay. And then how did the bond amounts get established? And why do bond amounts vary so much from case to case, even when the charges look similar or identical?
We've just discussed there's a bond schedule, and that's usually set by the judicial district as to what they think the appropriate bond is depending on the level of crime. The more serious down to the less serious, the more serious crime you have, the higher the bond is expected to be. The less serious, the lesser the bond. And that's usually determined by the judicial district as to what they think is the norm. And then the judges pretty much follow that schedule. But there are a number of things that cause judges to vary from that schedule to make the bond either less or more than the schedule. Mitigating circumstances or, again, criminal history and flight risk. Those are the two things that people look at to determine more or less, is this person a danger to society if their bond isn't higher? Because remember, the point of bond is to ensure that you're back in court. That's the number one priority of bond, is to put the bond in such an amount that if you don't appear in court, you're losing a significant amount of money. And the more serious the charge, the more likely it is you may not appear in court. So the purpose of bond is to ensure that you do come to court.
James, I'm curious if your personal net worth has any influence on that, because folks who obviously are wealthier, those numbers may be easier for them to cover those those costs, those dollar amounts, versus somebody who has less access to funds.
It's interesting you bring that up because you see that on TV all the time. You say,
We
well,
do.
Mr. Smith, you were going to surrender your passport because you're a flight risk. That's not an unrealistic thing that happens in real life. It happens a lot that people with some funds, with some means, they do have access to leave the country. Now, the truth of the matter is that it's difficult to leave the country if you have a serious case pending. That often comes through in, you know, uh, computer searches and computer histories when you try to board an airplane. But nevertheless, it's a legitimate concern, and I've seen it brought up a number of times. And you're right, your net worth has a lot to do with whether or not you sit in jail. Because obviously, if you're sitting in jail, you're not working, so you either have to have enough assets that can cover the bond that allow you to post the bond, or your family has enough assets to cover the bond or post the bond. So yeah, money does enter into this. Your ability to pay. Um, and it's not uncommon to see people with very low bonds sit in jail because they don't have $150 to get out of jail. They have normally a bondsman will charge you anywhere from 10 to 15% of the bond. So for example, if you have a $1,500 bond, it's a cash property or surety bond. A bondsman will very likely charge you $150 to get out of jail. You'd be surprised how many people sit in jail because they don't have the $150 to get out of jail. So they sit in jail.
Yeah. There's
And that's a whole nother episode about bail reform and that's been going on throughout the country. But that's a reality that happens a lot that they can't get out of jail for $150.
So we've talked about the financial situation, the timing of it. You mentioned briefly the person's prior record, and how that can maybe affect how long somebody stays in jail. Do you want to speak more about that? How much does a person's prior record change what happens at this stage when they're establishing bond?
Well, like I said, what happens is the judge will look at a criminal history and determine if there is a criminal history, what kind of criminal history. For example, if you're being held on an assault charge, if you have a prior criminal history that indicates prior assaults, other cases that were assault in nature, the judge often will look at the paperwork and say, I think this person is a person that's a danger to society. So I'm going to increase the bond and have him sit in jail till he posts this increased bond. If he posts the increased bond, then he can get out. But the judge will say, in my opinion, with my allowed discretion, this person's a danger to society. So I'm going to increase the bond. And so, money sometimes enters. Can you make the scheduled bond, but not make the increased bond? So sometimes that enters into the picture. Did that answer your question?
It did. And I'm curious if there are other areas where people run into problems getting released even after a bond is set.
It's mostly financial, just like we discussed.
Okay.
That,
Okay.
you know, because the higher the bond, for example, if we've kind of talked about schedules, about a certain class of crime has a certain bond. Let's say that you have a bond that normally is $50,000, but the judge has increased it to 250,000, five times the schedule. Okay. So what started as a $50,000 bond with a 10% premium, that's $5,000, right? To a bondsman. At $250,000, it changes because now a bondsman not only wants that 10% premium, they also want $250,000 worth of collateral, which often includes the title of someone's house. And very few people have $250,000 equity in a home. So it can change that increased bond keeps somebody in jail because they don't have the collateral. A bondsman will very often post a $50,000 bond on a cosigner's signature, not on 250,000, because the consequences if this person doesn't show up on a $250,000 bond, guess who pays that 250,000? It's the bondsman and the cosigner. So very few bondsmen would agree to do that without that much collateral. And there aren't many people that have $250,000 equity or collateral to post that bond.
So that's a big one. If a bond is set higher than someone can afford, are there options to bring it down, or are there other ways for them to still get out of jail?
I very often will ask the judge to reduce the bond and maybe increase or change bond conditions so that whatever concerns the judge had, such as public safety, can be addressed with bond conditions, not money. For example, um, an ankle monitor. If you had put an ankle monitor on somebody, you can determine where and when they're at 24 hours, 7 days a week. So that usually will kind of reduce the concern of the judge that this is a public safety risk if the judge feels that way. If you put an ankle monitor on somebody, um, you can determine where they are. Uh, UAs, urine analysis for drugs or alcohol, make sure that they're part of bond conditions so that the judge's concerns about drug and alcohol use are addressed. So very often you can ask for conditions of bond that will reduce the judge's anxiety about this person and being kind of unmonitored in the public.
What are the consequences if someone violates those conditions, or maybe violates them without realizing it? There's two questions there. What if they intentionally violate, and what if they violate without realizing they violated?
Well, very often what happens is there's an arrest warrant issued for violation of bond conditions, and you go back to jail, and the old bond is now reinstated. You know, if you were if the bond was reduced from that 250 that we've talked about, say it was reduced down to 100, which you very well could get a bondsman to do it for 100. You go out and yeah, you violate those conditions. Generally, you'll go back into jail and you'll have to post at least the 250, if not more, to get out of jail a second time.
So there's no forgiveness, there's no leniency here. If you violate, you're going back.
Pretty much.
And how does staying in custody start to affect the outcome of a case versus being out while the case is pending?
Well, it's so much more difficult to prepare a defense and have consistent communication, consistent meetings with your client if he's in custody. It's just not the same thing as having open access to a client where you can have multiple meetings that um, they're just clients just seem like there's a lot of pressure when you go and prepare for a trial in jail. You just don't have the same resources that you can use. I mean, you can bring in the discovery, go over that, and prepare your defense, but clients are more comfortable preparing for it. You can't go to the scene of the crime with your client, for example. If he's out of custody, you can, but if he's in custody, you can't take him out and walk him through the crime scene. But you can if the client's out of custody.
Makes sense. We interchange the words bond and bail today. Is there a difference between those two? And can you explain what it would be?
Practically, there really isn't a whole lot of difference. No,
Okay.
bond is simply practically no. I mean, there's some semantical differences, but practically there's not a difference.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like people to know about posting bond in Colorado?
No, it's a situation where, for the most part, every case is entitled to bond, but as we've discussed, it isn't as easy as it sounds. It's not cut and dried. No, I can't think of anything else.
I think that's where we'll leave it today then, James. Thank you so much for your time and insights on how this process works.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning into Colorado Criminal Defense with James Colgan. For expert legal advice or to schedule a consultation, visit jpcolganlaw.com. And remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so that the next person who needs this will have access. We'll see you in the next episode. Come on back.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.